Hello and welcome to today's webinar, New Approaches to Faster Oracle Forms Systems Performance. On behalf of everyone at Correlsense and OraPlayer, we welcome to your webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to go through our agenda. We're going to begin the presentation talking a little bit about all the things that make Oracle Forms management difficult to the enterprise. Then we'll talk about how to improve the performance of your form systems. Then some strategies for monitoring Oracle Forms. And finally, we'll tie things up at the end with a summary and Q&A. A little bit of housekeeping before we get going. The presentation today will last about 30 minutes. If you have questions along the way, we'll try to take them and answer them as we get going. No questions too stupid or crazy. Just pop them into the chat window and we'll try to answer them as we go. And finally, we'll try to make the slides and the video of the presentation available tomorrow if you want to share it with friends or download it. And first of all, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Mia Urman. Mia is the CEO of OraPlayer.
Hello, everybody.
She has extensive experience in the Oracle Forms and Oracle developer environment, first in working with Oracle and now as the CEO of a company that supports Oracle products. You guys can read her bio. Maybe to move a little bit faster in this presentation, maybe I can move forward to myself. I'm Frank Days. I'm the head of marketing here at Correlsense. I'll be kind of our master of ceremonies while Mia really handles all the heavy lifting and talks about all the stuff that you're probably most interested about today. So without further ado, maybe we can hand it over to Mia.
Hi, everybody. Today, basically, we're going to be talking about Oracle Form System Performance. Apparently, it's a problem for many running form systems. I'm not focusing on any specific version. I'm going to talk pretty generically. And if you have questions, please feel free to write in the chat window, and we'll try to answer your questions. The first thing I wanted to know is, basically how many of you are actually suffering from Oracle Forms performance problems. It always gives me kind of a guide on if I should focus on, improving and optimization, or really, how to figure out where our problem areas are and how to solve those issues as they arise. So when everybody finished voting, okay. So basically, the problem with Oracle Forms in general is the architecture. Again, some people will say it's a problem. I say it's actually an incredible thing that they've done. They've taken basically a client-server application. Instead of making it completely obsolete and telling everybody to just basically rewrite your entire application by web, what they've been able to do is to take the client-server portion of the form and run it on a web server, an application server, whether that's Oracle IS, Internet Application Server of Oracle, or today WebLogic Server, which is actually a very robust and great server. In front of it, they've put an Apache HTTP listener. Basically, that's a listener that listens to the URL that is entered into the browser on the client machine. It sees that if that URL contains the forms tag, and then it basically knows that the application server will be running a forms session. Of course, as in any forms application, it is based on data stored in the Oracle database. And on the client side, we actually have a small Java atlas that is downloaded to the client, and it helps render the forms window, which is basically draw the objects on the screen, whether they be text items, radio buttons, or what have you. Basically, if you look at this architecture, when your users call and say, my system is running slow, most of us sit around and scratch our heads. We're like, I wonder where I'm having this performance problem, right? Is it in the web tier? Is it in the application server? Is it in the database? Is it that the client doesn't have enough memory? Basically, a little bit how it works. A regular Java application, what happens is the user runs the Java application. The entire application, including the business logic, is downloaded to the client. And then all of the application logic is performed on the client side. What Oracle Forms server platform has done, which is actually very interesting, is they run the business logic of the application on the server, And the only thing that is downloaded to the client are basically messages, metadata, of how to draw the application. Meaning, what's on the client side is a Java applet that basically is a drawer. It's a paintbrush. He is told messages from the server, what items to draw on the screen. He will get a message, draw a button at X position, Y position, with this width and height, and he will draw it. Because all that's going over the network is this metadata, it makes the Forms application much lighter weight than traditional Java applications. And because they use this algorithm of just passing metadata, we're able to really use that to our benefit to try to minimize network traffic of messages going over the network. So two basic examples of how we could use this architecture to our benefit is there's something called string buffering. Basically, if on one Oracle Forms screen the same string appears several times, the metadata that is sent is only the string one time and 3 other places where it should appear on the screen. So it's not that every string that appears on the form is being sent over the network. They're being sent in something called string buffering, which is each string is then just referenced on the client. The same thing with something called event bundling. Oracle Forms is a trigger-based user interface, which means that there are different triggers that occur based on different items that are selected or manipulated. So, for example, when you exit a field on a form, 5 different triggers get fired, right? Post change, post item, when validate item, pre-item, when new item instance. The way that Oracle Forms does their message handling is it sends all of those triggers as one bundle in one shot. So it really tries to minimize the amount of network round trips that are performed. So how can we use that to our advantage? When we talk about form system optimization, we talk about a few things. One is minimizing the startup time, right? In today's web era, you put a URL and you expect everything to load right away, and if it doesn't, you start clicking numerous times, right? So we want to try to minimize the startup time. We want to try to minimize the amount of time people are waiting to see the original screen. We want to minimize client resource requirements, right? We don't want the clients to basically look frozen or have situations where things are getting stuck on the client side. We want to optimize the form server resources requirements. We want to use as little network messaging as possible. So we want to try to accomplish as much of those messages transferring in one network conversation. And when rendering, we want to be as efficient as possible. We don't want to render 500 fields if we only need 3, right? We want to try to keep our coding as lightweight as possible. To minimize startup time, the first thing that Oracle introduced in the later versions is something called pre-starting, which is actually a really good trick. It allows you, it's something that you do in the Oracle Forms server settings that allows you to pre-start 5 or more form sessions, which means that when the user actually requests the session, there's one already waiting. It's also called Oracle Forms Server Web Pooling, and there's basically a pool of 5 or however many you set sessions ready to go, and it really minimizes a lot of the startup time. Another thing that can really help with startup time is something called perceived performance. There's an image called the splash screen that appears very early on in the form loading process, and that splash screen could be any image you'd like. So a lot of my clients, we've kind of designed a little welcome to our system screen, because the minute they see an image pop up into their screen, they feel like they've already started seeing the system working, even if it's not the actual first form of the application. So that's actually an HTML parameter. It could be set in the Forms Web CFG configuration file. Another tip that I give people is to try to reduce the time to draw the initial screen. Right? If you think of how Google became so famous in our day and age, they have one text item and one text label. They are the fastest loading page on the planet. We try to think that way also for the first Oracle Forms screen that people see. The lighter weight it is, the faster it will load. And then, of course, you could call other forms, but once you're in the system, the users already have a perception that they've started working with the system. So the time to initialize the first form is, of course, heavily influenced by how busy it is and how many canvases are set to be visible. So a lot of times what we suggest is, instead of setting all the canvases by default in the previous versions, most of the canvases had a property called raise on entry, and it was set to true. We recommend to set raise on entry false, which basically means on entry to the screen, you don't have to raise all 6 canvases and then only show 1. You could raise just the first canvas, and then all the other canvases will be shown when you call them as needed. So basically, even if something is not visible to the end user, if it is raise on entry true, you're still waiting for all those items to load. So if a canvas isn't visible but it has 50 items, you're going to basically load the canvas and the 15 items and then only show the first canvas that might be on top of that canvas that's loaded. So we really want to try to understand what the user is actually seeing and work with better navigation between the canvases. Again, all of these tips today are tips that I suggest when you find specific forms that happen to be suffering from poor performance. Like, I'm not suggesting everybody go into their entire system and start changing all the properties and do a whole revamping of the system. What I suggest is, a lot of times when users complain about specific forms that are acting slow or heavy or rendering slowly, right? A lot of times my users complain that they see flashes. Like, they'll see a flash of a canvas and then a flash of another canvas jumps on top of it. Those type of complaints, I then go into those forms and actually do the changes. So it could be also on a need, on a from case-by-case basis. So another thing that's very interesting about Oracle Forms is the whole issue of navigation. In the past, what we tried to do is limit the amount of form files, FMVs, we had, and try to jam as much logic and as many canvases and as many windows into one form as possible. Actually, on the web, we recommend the opposite. We recommend to keep the form itself under 5 canvases and 5 windows, and to actually call forms. Because when you call other forms, it actually makes the form itself, it loads much, much clearer. So there's 2 different type of resources that are used for open form and form navigation. There's the one type is called open form and call form. These actually leave the original form open on the server, and the properties are then cached on the client. So this, of course, consumes memory on the client side, but it reduces the amount of network trips needed to reload that same form when you've called a second form, right? So if you have the intention of actually working in parallel on 2 different forms, or if you have the intention of having some sort of wizard-based logic where you run 3 different forms, but you want people to go back to the forms quite frequently, the originating forms, then you'd use an open form and call form and actually keep those forms open in the back of the memory. For actual navigation, where you're ready to move to a new form altogether, so that could be a different module. Like if you were in the HR module, now you want to move to the orders module, you do something called new form. Basically what that does is it closes the original forms on the server. The properties that were cached on the client side are destroyed, and then it of course removes it from the memory on the server and client. However, if you happen to want to go back to those original forms, it will be more network round trips to actually bring that UI and load it again. Okay, so a lot of times you could play between using resources on the client versus using network round trips. So a few of my clients have seen performance issues where all of a sudden on one form screen they stop seeing certain labels, certain titles, and they call me and they say, I don't know, I can't really pinpoint when it happens, but all of a sudden I lose a lot of the titles on the screen, they seem to vanish. That is a symptom of having not enough memory on the client side. So a lot of those people I suggest to actually move to a new form when they actually run a new form as opposed to using call form, because it's obvious that the client-side memory is not enough to support the design of the form system as it is. What could we actually do to help minimize the amount of network round trips and actually maximize the amount of information that will go in one trip? So it's actually funny, the tip is what people have been doing development, I hope, for years already, which is using standards, working with standard object libraries, visual attributes, object groups, having a standard look and feel of the items, and using inheritance. The reason this is so important is because of what we talked about earlier, which is the issue of string buffering. Okay? If two items are almost identical, only one property is different, let's say only the title is different, the form metadata is smart enough to say, draw me 7 buttons, here, here, and here, and then also just add these 7 titles. Okay? So they're able to basically, by us promoting similarity, by having similar items, the forms are able to just send delta messages over the network on the properties in the property palette that are different between the items, and most of the time for things like buttons, it'll be just the title. Most of the time for text items, it'll be just the titles themselves. So for us, if we have been working with these standard object libraries and templates, we're actually benefiting a lot from the way Oracle Forms works in terms of metadata. Another thing that's very interesting is Oracle Forms also understands properties when it comes to triggers. Okay, for example, set item property. If you have an area where you do 10 set item properties in a row, Oracle Forms is smart enough to send only one message of set item property, and then just the difference in the parameters for each of the items, like just the item name, weight, and if it's changed to bold, for example. So a lot of times if you have 3 set item properties in a row, and then 2 other triggers in a row, and then again 3 set item properties in a row, just by grouping all the set item properties together in one section will actually save you a network trip. So again, I'm not stating this so that we could go in and change all of our code and all of our systems, but it is a nice tip for how to do proper development from now on. Same thing with boilerplates and images. Okay, in the past, the title used to be a graphic item and not an item that was on the property palette. If you've been upgraded from 6i, for example, there is something called associate prompt, which allows you to take a textual item and attach it to a graphic item, such as a text box. And that's what was recommended a lot of times when people upgraded from 6i. Another thing that is actually very interesting is if you're going to be using different type of graphic images, such as circles, squares, or what have you, I suggest to use the frames option of Oracle Forms, because since that has a property palette as well, it also is much more fine-tuned in terms of metadata. And if you're going to use one of the boilerplate objects, graphic objects, try to use items that have an X and Y axis, such as squares or lines. Because think about it, if you have to describe to somebody how to draw a circle, you basically are giving the X and Y position of 500 different points to make a circle. If you need to give somebody a metadata message on how to draw a line, you could say, this is point A and this is point B, and attach them. So it's really, really interesting that you should really try to keep things as angular as possible. Another problematic item in terms of performance are tab canvases. Because what happens is, usually when tab canvases load, if there's 15 tabs, all items on all 15 tabs will load, and then you will only see the first tab. If you have forms with tab canvases that are having performance issues, what you are able to do is to put the items, instead of being directly on a tab, they could be on a canvas, on a stacked canvas that rests on top of the tab. And that way you could use the trigger when tab page changed, which occurs when you click on a second tab page, to do raise on entry yes, and to see those other additional items. So that way it won't preload every tab on the form. It'll only load the first tab that you're seeing on the screen. In terms of images, another quick tip is to use what's called a jar file to download the images. How it works now is anytime you have an image or on an iconic button, it does a network trip to actually download the image from the server. If you use a jar file, how it works is when the system is loading initially, a zip file or jar file of all the images are downloaded to the client and they're cached on the client, and therefore all the images are taken from the client as needed. The jar file stays on the client and it's only re-downloaded if there has been a change in the jar file. So essentially it's something that loads once. If there's no changes, it stays on the client side, and it really helps with network traffic in terms of if you have a system that's very heavy in iconic buttons. Network and mouse triggers, we know, are a pretty big no-no in terms of system performance. If you have to use a mouse trigger, you must put it on the lowest level. Basically, you cannot use mouse move triggers. You could use only double click or when mouse click, and try to use those even only on specific items and not on the block or form level. Same thing with timers. In the past, we used to use timers for almost everything. Basically, what happens is those timers are just performing 60,000 round trips of network traffic. In the future, like nowadays, almost anything we use the timer for, right? Progress bar, clocks, animation, any of those things, there's actually portable Java components to take care of those items. I suggest that anything you actually need, before you actually use a timer, you should really think carefully. If you must use a timer, you could try to actually minimize the amount of round trips by setting the time as needed. The timer delays as needed, but again, I really highly suggest you look into using portable Java components to replace the timer functionalities that you used to use. Another big no-no is the word synchronize. In the past, anytime anything used to work a little bit unexplained in Oracle Forms, like any bug, they would say, oh, don't worry, just write synchronize. It was the universal weapon for any coding problem that used to happen in client server. The problem is the word synchronize on the web basically means redraw everything that was on the screen. So anytime you write the word synchronize, you're basically reloading all the items on the screen. And the truth is that 90% of the bugs that we used to use the word synchronize for have been fixed in 10G and 11G, so we don't actually even need those words anymore. So just to summarize very quickly, because I'm already over time, you should try to optimize the form design going forward, which is using subclasses, object libraries, visual attributes, using PL libraries, right? Using coding libraries so that the code is shared in a common library. Minimize the use of graphic items that are not lines or squares. Use prompts instead of titles or graphic boilerplates. And, of course, the golden rules. A slow server will never run anything fast. I can't tell you how many systems I've gone to where they're like, wow, it's so slow. And I go to their server and I try to just look at, to open Notepad++ and it takes 15 minutes, right? You can't think without brains. If the server doesn't have enough memory to function, it will not have enough memory to run Oracle Forms. And I highly suggest also that you do some sort of testing on the load, like to make sure your hardware can handle it. Also check things like, is virus checker enabled? Is there anything that could be delaying the network traffic? Any type of ports, firewalls, etc. that could be interfering with running of the systems. Another quick tip is to locate the application server close to the database server. Because you don't want to also be suffering from network delays from the database queries. Of course, all of these things are easier said than done, right? I'm sure you're going to be asking yourselves, well, how can we check that the hardware can handle the load? How can we understand where the bottleneck is between the database on the application server or between the application server and the client. And this is where this is how I kind of got introduced to Correlsense. They actually have a very interesting monitoring module for Oracle Forms where they can actually see rendering times and wait times between each of the layers that we discussed earlier. So now I'm going to hand off to Frank so he can tell us a little bit more about their very interesting solution.
Great. Well, thank you, Mia, and thanks for an informative presentation. So now it's a great segue into what I'm going to talk about in a moment here, which is share a little bit of information. If we can go next slide, please. About strategies and technology platform for monitoring Oracle Forms-based applications. Go next slide, please. So obviously in production and optimization, one of the key things that you want to keep in mind is how is your forms performing, how are your forms application performing from end to end, right? If there's a problem, and as Mia talked about, the form systems, it's not just a standalone singular system, but often in an enterprise setting connected to a lot of different things, whether it's app servers or web servers, lots of different pieces and parts, and you need a solution that can actually see your application both from the end user experience, what kind of rendering time, what's the end user seeing? Because response time at the end of the day is the thing that matters most, right? What your end user is experiencing out there is what their perception of how your application is performing, all the way through to how all your different components along that path are performing. So one of the first things you can do, obviously, is to make sure you track all of your requests through all the different hops on the path through there. And again, talking about how integrated these systems are, it's not always Java and .NET apps, but many times they are. And having the ability or having a tool that can track these things is really powerful, whether it's Apache or OC for Java or Forms Runtime Oracle Database. You really need something that can track across the entire path. Can we go next slide, please? So the other cool thing that you can get from using SharePath or from Correlsense for monitoring your Oracle Forms app is when you're looking at the individual transactions, it can translate the individual transactions to meaningful names. So when you're trying to solve some of the problems and trying to identify maybe what the root cause of, the core part of your application that's causing the slowdown, you can look at and get some responsiveness, response time data on the individual transactions, which then you can leverage in your troubleshooting and improvement to the performance. You also need to get a clear view of how things interact. So in this case, this is an example of a real-time map that's created by SharePath from Correlsense. In real-time automatically creates a mapping of the topology of how all the individual components are working. So if a component, you bring a server online, you take a server down, it automatically would discover where the transaction is flowing and also give you a sense of how the traffic and transactions are flowing in relative speed basis between the individual components, so you can quickly identify where a bottleneck may be occurring in your server flow. So again, in summary, SharePath, life is more than Java and .NET in Forms environments. SharePath brings you the broadest coverage of applications across a number of technologies, Forms being one of them, but also a whole lot of other things that come along with it. Another interesting fact is that it does provide views for operations support as well as for developers and engineering. So with one product, all of your different stakeholders can have dashboards that are tailored to their individual interests and point of views. It does not require any specific code changes to your product or instrumentation. It's really a product that sits with collectors on servers and watches the traffic as it flows. And it can automatically, as I mentioned on the earlier path, detect your traffic and your path so you can have a clear view of how your infrastructure is set, whether things are up and down. So in summary, Forms, obviously, as Mia had talked a little bit about, there are many potential challenges in keeping your Oracle Forms environment performing at a high level. Optimizing it in the design and production stages can have a great impact on how your application performs. And if you're looking for a tool to help you monitor those, SharePath is really the only end-to-end product in the APM space that can help you monitor your Oracle Forms or eBusiness Suite-based applications. Well, this wraps up things today. Mia, thank you again for joining us today, another informative webinar. If you should have questions, there are some emails. Certainly you can request a live demo at info@correlsense.com or email me or Mia. You can see Mia's email. I know Mia blogs quite a lot as well, and she's a great person to reach out to on Twitter. But please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about it. Once again, Tom McEwen, our producer, who's not on the thing but has been changing the slides in the background, is the guy who's going to post the slides to SlideShare later today and probably have the video up tomorrow morning. I'll make sure Tom sends an email to everyone so you can get it if you want to share this info to everyone. And once again, on behalf of everyone here at Correlsense as well as the folks at OraPlayer, thank you for joining us today and have a wonderful day.